Welcome to GPS, God's Prophetic Surprises, the program in which we take an intergenerational approach to the book of Revelation. I'm Jon Paulien, professor of New Testament at Loma Linda University, and with me are a couple of my colleagues who can introduce themselves.
It's great to be here. My name is Gustavo Assis, a pastor in Orange County, hopefully finishing my PhD very soon on Old Testament.
And where are you doing that?
At Boston College. I'm not commuting from Boston to California. I'm just writing the dissertation from here. So.
Very good. Glad you could be with us.
Yes, and I'm a PhD student in New Testament at Andrews University, and I'm also a pastor locally as well.
For those who haven't seen the program before, what is your name?
I'm Guilherme Borda.
Okay,
yes.
Very good. A couple of my Brazilian sidekicks, I like to say here. We have some good discussions.
I wonder if we can have, after you guys complete the entire book of Revelation, to do the same thing, but in Portuguese.
I'll leave that to the two of you.
We can do like a podcast format or something.
Yeah, yeah, go over some of the same ground. That would be great. Well, when we left off last time, we were in verse 1 of chapter 17, and let me just read that again so that our audience is fresh. One of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me. All right, so it's one of the seven bowl angels in chapter 16. You had the seven last plagues. And one of these comes to explain further. All right, so the question is, which one? Come, I will show you the punishment or the judgment of the great prostitute who sits on many waters. And we concluded at the end last time that it's one of the three plagues that deals with water, must be. And of those, the Euphrates River, of course, being the river of Babylon, would seem to be the logical plague to be referring to here, the sixth plague. But I have one further thing to show, and you might be aware of this, Gustavo. But if you go to Jeremiah 51 and verse 13, you have an interesting text. This is the prophet speaking to Babylon. In chapter 51, verse 13, you who live by many waters. That's the exact turn of phrase you have in chapter 17, verse 1. I said last time, to really understand Revelation, you have to see the threads back to the Old Testament, the threads to the gospel in the New, and sometimes threads to other parts of Revelation. That as you pay attention to that matrix, difficult texts suddenly become a little bit easier to understand. So Babylon is by many waters. Of course, those many waters are the Euphrates River. So it's the angel of the sixth plague is coming to explain something to John. All right? And it talks about a great prostitute. Gustavo, what is the spiritual significance of prostitution in the Old Testament, where you've done so much study?
Well, we have quite a lot about this metaphor, this idea of, let's say, the people of God committing spiritual prostitution or spiritual infidelity into the covenant with God. So you have this. Well, I use the language of being unfaithful. So you are committed to a spouse, and all of a sudden you are seeking pleasure, fulfillment with other partners. And that is repeatedly one of the charges that the prophets bring against first Israel, then Judah. You see that clearly in Hosea, which is a prophet representing God and his wife, Gomer, who is a prostitute, going after lovers, and the language of clients, you are doing that to receive something from them. So there is a spiritual side of going to other deities. The language of idolatry also it is compared to the language of prostitution, but also of political unfaithfulness to God. So instead of relying on God to receive, let's say, economical safety, a safety net, or military guidance and protection, Israelites and Judeans were going to Egypt, were going to Assyria. And in Isaiah chapter 2, I think, or Jeremiah 2, I'm sorry, you have the language of drinking from the water from Egypt is the same as, I'd say, being partnership with Egypt. And the same thing with drinking from the waters of the Euphrates is in partnership with the civilizations from that part. So,
Interesting.
tying up all this, prostitution is the language of infidelity to God in terms of religious components, the covenants, and also, let's say, politically forgetting God and seeking help from earthly powers.
Now, this is a question probably directed at someone who knows everything. Okay, so if this goes past that, it's okay, but you're my best shot at getting an answer. Okay. Is there any point that you're aware of in the Old Testament where the image of prostitution is directed to the pagans?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So
he does know everything.
Oh, no,
okay.
no, not quite. Tell that to my wife. She'll say otherwise. I think the clearest example of that is not Babylon per se. Maybe Babylon. I don't recall Babylon being called a prostitute in the Old Testament, but Nineveh, the city of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, it is called a prostitute in the book of Nahum. So, which is, I'll call Nahum Jonah 2.0, or the sequel of Jonah, because it is targeting Nineveh. Now Nineveh is destroyed, and Nineveh is being called a prostitute. And always, let's say, having lovers from other nations and bringing idolatry to other nations. So there is that charge in the book of
well, that kind of salvages my theory, though, because as I was listening to you, my theory was if prostitution is always prostitution away from Yahweh, then Babylon must be a Christian entity in some way, if that language is going to be applied. And John might have seen that to be the case.
But I think even in the book of Nahum, some of the punishments that Nineveh is receiving are the punishments that are coming to those who break the covenant with God in Deuteronomy 28, for example. So it is like God is holding that nation the same standards that He's expecting His people, Israel and Judah, to present every moment in the relationship between the two parts. I think so. I think that is the case, and I think this prostitute has many key characteristics of a religious power.
Well, you see that. Sorry, I'll get to you in just a moment.
Go ahead.
This is really interesting to me because Assyria is portrayed in the Old Testament as a converted nation with Jonah.
Yeah.
They heard the preaching of a Yahwistic prophet, an Israelite prophet, and they converted in such a way that God removed the judgment upon them that had been there before. So if Nahum comes after, or Nahum, I guess as many would say, comes after Jonah, then in a real sense they have left Yahweh, who had embraced him, at least for a time. So perhaps, I'm still thinking about that, but does the language of prostitution by itself indicate who Babylon is or not? That's my, and I appreciate your thinking on it. Go ahead, Yerme.
Go ahead.
One thing that I find interesting here concerning the connection between Babylon and Christianity that you brought up is this word come. Because this word in the Greek, deuro, only appears twice in Revelation. And it seems to present two options, two outcomes that happen from the same background. So earlier in the book, you have that virtuous woman in chapter 12, representing the people of God, right? And we're going to get more into that soon, I imagine. But then here, the angel says, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters. And then the only other place that there's this word deuro, come, is in chapter 21, verse 9, and it is another lady that is shown. It says, chapter 21, verse 9, then one of the seven angels, it's also one of the seven angels, who had the seven bowls filled with the seven last plagues, came to me and talked with me, saying, come, It's the same exact Greek word, deuro. I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. So here we have two options. And it is up to us to choose whether we want to be associated with the first or the second.
You're right. Those two texts are very strongly parallel, 21:9 and 17:1. So that's our prophetic surprise, at least for me so far in this program. I appreciate those thoughts. Yeah.
Would you mind if I just share something about Babylon? Because we were talking about Nineveh and having this, let's say, early acceptance or repentance and then turning away from God. I think something parallel to that happened to, let's say, Babylon, or at least one king of Babylon, which is Nebuchadnezzar. I know the portrait of Nebuchadnezzar in the book of Daniel, like repenting and everything, but using him as a kind of representative of Babylon, you have a few prophets in the Bible who are, you can, for lack of a better expression, pro-Babylon in their presentation. Jeremiah is one. He even calls Nebuchadnezzar God's servant, a title that is only designated to a few individuals in the entire book, like I think David or Jacob are the other two. And so Ezekiel is also pro-Babylon in the way he presents the geopolitics of his days. But you have another prophet who is not happy with Babylon and God's plan, which is Habakkuk. So you could even see this, let's say, initially God's favoring utilizing Babylon for his purposes to punish his people, to kind of the instrument of, let's say, the execution of the judgment of the breaking of the covenant. But then Babylon, the passage that you cited in Jeremiah 51 is the oracle, the prophecy against Babylon, the destruction of the city of Babylon. And so you can see this, let's say, what was helpful in the past, what was useful for God's purposes in the past is now the target of his judgment, of his punishment.
And there's no question that dynamic is there, that Israel at times was useful to God and at times was not, and came under the same judgments that God passed on others. Babylon was at times useful, at times was not. Even among the Canaanites, you have Rahab and her family, it says, and they became part of Israel from that day forward. So God wasn't anti-Canaanites either, you know, but it was a question of how they stood in relation to him. That was the one thing that matters in Scripture, how we stand in relation to God. So let's read, perhaps, Guillermo, if you could do that. Read verses 1 to 5 of chapter 17, and you know, let's see what we learn there.
Sure. Today I'm reading from the New King James Version, and it says, "Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls came and talked with me, saying to me, 'Come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication. And the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication.' So he carried me away in the Spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth."
All right, so here we have a prostitute, and then we have a woman, and apparently those two are the same thing, because the woman is a prostitute, even the head of the house, so to speak, of prostitution. So you have imagery here of Babylon as an end-time, worldwide, powerful entity. So the question I have for you is, if this prostitute in verse 1 is Babylon, what does that represent when you think of the end time setting? We're at the very end of time. This is the context of the Battle of Armageddon, the 7 last plagues. What role does Babylon play, and why would you draw that conclusion?
I think it is the kind of power that brings everybody together, it seems. Because in verse 2, you have the kings of the earth committing sexual immorality. The dwellers of on earth have become drunk with the wine that she has. So she's bringing everybody together. So it is like this magnet that is bringing people from all the sides, and probably all unrelated, but they find, let's say, common ground in the great city, in the great prostitute.
Well, Guillermo, earlier I tossed out the theory that Babylon as a prostitute must perhaps be some fallen entity within Christendom. The follower, Revelation's directed to the followers of Jesus, and yet here, what images here would support that idea?
Yes, one thing that would support that is, to begin with, the fact that you have a woman, that you have earlier in the book, in chapter 12, a woman with the different features that fit the description of representing the people of God. But that was a nice lady. And then here we have a nasty one. No wonder that later John marvels at what he's seeing. And so that's one of the evidences. But then more than that, when you start seeing the description of this picture, of this scene that John, that is before John, this beast that this woman is sitting on has 7 heads and 10 horns. You start thinking of language that takes you back to chapter 13. And in chapter 13, and this I have to refer our viewers back to the episodes in chapter 13, because it really is a long discussion. I would say there is slam dunk evidence to really identify the sea beast of chapter 13. And in our discussion, we have associated with papal Rome. As surprising as it might seem to many, and as sad as it is, which is sad. And so that connection with chapter 13 is also a strong evidence of this Christian side of this woman here. Now, one thing that is interesting to ask is, okay, we may think of what happened in the Middle Ages, but how could that ever happen again? Well, you can think about just different factors, general principles that happened at that time, that happened, some of them, throughout different moments in history that I believe will happen in the time of the end too. One has to do with dynamics of power. A power that gains strength and finds a vacuum or a need that it fills. And then second is wealth, which you see depicted right here. You see the notion of power. This woman is sitting on a beast. Just that picture alone, and when you take the notion of the symbolism of a beast representing a power or a kingdom that you see in apocalyptic language, that alone conveys the notion of power, right? So there's the notion of power, but here also look at all that she's adorned and arrayed with: purple and scarlet and gold, precious stones, pearls. In all of this speaks wealth. This happened in the Middle Ages, will happen again. The combination of the dynamics of power, a vacuum or a need, and wealth, but also a message. With the message, you can think of the deception.
Let's pause on that for a moment, because you're really triggering something in my mind, maybe a prophetic surprise, okay? But in the beginning, the church was a persecuted minority. And it was persecuted somewhat by the Israel at the time, but mostly by the Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire became Christian, it just shifted its position a little bit, but then the Roman Empire collapsed. And all that was left in the Mediterranean world was the church, to hold things together. You see? So that's where you talked about a vacuum.
Yes.
And then the church became the one reliable power politically to hold things together for many hundreds of years. The problem is when the church gets involved in politics, it tends to lose its original identity to some degree. So you were going to finish something, and then Gustavo, I want to bring you into
So
this.
you have the dynamics of power, the wealth, then the message, which you see clearly in chapter 13, the notion of the deception, right? So that has to do with the message. Deception, you can think of propaganda. And then the fourth factor that would bring, not that these are the only ones, but the fourth factor is syncretism. One thing that can help bring people together is if part of their view is also incorporated in the game. So syncretism was something that happened during the Middle Ages and before, leading to that, and is something that will happen in the time of the end too. So at least these are some factors that I believe will contribute to the fulfillment of this picture here, as unimaginable as it might seem.
Well, every pastor knows that when somebody's interested in joining the church and they say, you know, I could join this church except for this one thing. It's very tempting to say, well, that's not a big deal. You know, come on in. You see, and I think that's a dynamic of syncretism you're talking about. Yes.
Reacting to what Guilherme just said, and still pondering on why we are seeing this as a religious power here, or a Christian power. I was wondering, and this is more a question, but I have a suggestion to make with depending on the answer. All these elements, purple, scarlet, juice, pearls, the golden cup, I mean, it is another reference to gold. Any chance that that could be an echo of the priestly garments in Exodus 28?
Absolutely. That was the next thing I was going to ask you. I says, who does this remind you of in the Old Testament?
High priest.
The high priest. Yeah. The golden crown with an inscription.
Exactly.
You know, the red, the scarlet, the purple, the stones, the gold.
I don't know. Excellent. I'm glad that my idea was validated here. Maybe I read this somewhere. I'm not saying that I'm bringing that up here. But there was one thing missing here in terms of colors that we don't see in the attire of the high priest, which is the color blue. And blue, maybe this is on purpose, so I'm just curious. Blue is the color of the gods in the ancient world. So Tutankhamun's sarcophagi, if you see blue there, it is made of a stone that comes from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli, the sapphire. And so the images of gods from ancient Mesopotamia, you see blue is because it's the color of the gods. And you don't see the divine color here. You see,
interesting,
almost like, let's say, almost, I mean, it is religious, reminiscent of the high priest attire, the clothes, but you don't see that divine color blue.
I see, what I'm thinking is Exodus 24, where the only time anybody actually saw God in the Old Testament is where Moses and Joshua and the elders were invited by God to come to the top of the mountain and have a meal with him. And when, you know, outside, God was this thunder and lightning and all this theophany stuff, you know, is going on. But when they passed inside, there was this beautiful blue stone or lake or something peaceful at the heart of God. You had the blue, and you had also the shalom, you know.
Exactly. So it is lapis lazuli, the name that we give to that stone, the gemstone, typically from Afghanistan. And because it was so foreign, so distant, that kings from, let's say, Egypt and Mesopotamia, they valued so much that it was the color for the gods. And you see God meeting people where they are in the Exodus story. And so you don't see that color here. And so it is It is deceptive because it is behaving as, let's say, religious, but is missing God's color.
Well, it's not only behaving as religious, but also goes even a step further of taking upon itself or attempting to the divine prerogative.
Exactly.
Right? What belongs only to God.
Exactly.
Right? So it's attempting to be divine.
Yeah.
But nobody could ever fully achieve that, so it always falls short at least one point. I love this, my prophetic surprise for today, that she's perfectly imaging the high priest of ancient Israel, but missing the color blue. And that is the one color that is clearly described inside the heart of God in Exodus 24. So I'm over here like saying, wow, I think we're onto something here. Here's the interesting thing. In chapter 12, you have a woman. And how is the dragon trying to eliminate the woman?
He's going after her.
By force. Yeah. They're going to throw a flood of water after her, chase her into the desert, etc. So he's trying to overcome by force. Doesn't work. So in chapter 13, he calls up a beast from the sea, a beast from the earth, and they're going to use deception. So there's the two methods of Satan, force and deception. The force didn't work. Chapter 17 suggests that the deception did. Because both of these women, chapter 12 and chapter 17, are in the desert. When John sees prostitute Babylon, he sees her in the desert. Last thing he saw in the desert was the pure woman of chapter 12. So something has happened. Notice Revelation is warning that unless the church is careful of its loyalty to God, it could end up just like Israel, being a prostitute. And that's the pattern in the Old Testament of God's people, a tendency to fall away from their loyalty. So this is powerful, I think, and helps us to realize that this Babylon figure is really important as we close this part of Revelation. This has been GPS.